This vaccine is this month suck everyone up for giving birth to identical twins, but that goes toss. Like, so the link to the video will be the description below. Go and check them out. So let's into this vaccine in 3, 2, 1.
When the first baby cried, Quentin let out a laugh that sounded like relief. He thought that was the end of it. Then another, sharper cry filled the room, and the world turned at once into something none of them had planned for.
Oh, really?
Quentin Hale and Arlo Finch had been part of each other's lives since a
Yeah,
cramped freshman dorm. They were classmates, then roommates, then
yeah.
lovers who learned how to share a tiny kitchen, a rent
Ooh
bill,
la la.
late-night ramen, and a stubborn dream. They wanted a
Big.
child that was theirs. Not an adoption paper with a blank family tree, not a distant donor mystery. A
Yeah,
small person who carried part of both of them. They worked hard. Quentin taught high school literature. Arlo fixed computers and later took a job in software support with hours that changed month to month. Life felt steady and quiet. They loved each other with the calm certainty of people who had stayed through finals, bad breakups, and the slow climb into adult paychecks. Years
yeah.
into their life together, after long talks and long lists of pros and cons, they decided IVF was the path they wanted. They wanted a baby with their genes, one child who was linked to them both. The plan they wrote down on the back of an envelope felt almost simple. Quentin would provide eggs. Arlo would provide sperm. The lab would fertilize outside the body, and then the embryo would go where it could grow. There was one problem. Quentin did not have a womb that could carry a pregnancy. Because of a past surgery, the part of his body that holds a pregnancy wasn't there. The doctor who
Oh,
took their
really?
case described a risky choice, a uterine transplant followed by IVF. It was experimental, expensive, and not guaranteed. But when they crossed
Oh,
each other's palms and looked at the photo of a newborn online, they both knew the answer. Dr. Alvarez, the surgeon who agreed to try, gave them a list of warnings. The transplant could be rejected, the embryo might not take, the
yeah.
whole process could fail. He talked in measured sentences that still felt like thunder when Quentin and Arlo walked back to their small apartment. They saved, and they argued, and they laughed to cover fear. They signed consent forms and sat in waiting rooms. The hospital smelled like coffee and antiseptic and a kind of desperate hope. Friends
Really?
asked if they were sure. Some family members were quiet.
Yeah.
Quentin and Arlo only knew this. They did not want to regret not trying. When the transplant went in, borrowed from a donor, and stitched with care, the recovery was slow. The first months were full of small victories. A clear blood test, an ultrasound that showed nothing harmful. Quentin learned how to move through the world with new stitches and new rules. He had to avoid heavy lifting, certain medications, all the things that had defined his pre-surgery life. Arlo took on more shifts to pay for the bills. Love turned practical. Phone reminders for medications, soft meals, the steady presence of another hand. There was a quiet laboratory moment that mattered more than any celebration.
Yeah.
Quentin's ovaries were still his. The doctors could retrieve eggs from them. On the day of retrieval, Quentin lay under bright lights and woke with small aches. The lab called later. They had good eggs. Arlo came with a small box of nerves and hope. His sperm sample would be used. The fertilization itself was not magic, but it felt like it. In a cold, sterile lab, the embryologist mixed a single egg from Quentin with sperm from Arlo. Sometimes they had a tiny helping hand, a small needle in a process called ICSI, to place one sperm directly into the egg. The couple chose that because they wanted the best chance. The cell accepted the
Yeah.
tiny invader, and in a day the embryo began to divide, a pulsing dot of
Everyone.
possibility. They made more than one embryo, because that's what everyone did. Insurance against bad luck. The
Yeah.
embryologists
I
watched
didn't
for the
quite like
signs
him.
that cells were dividing normally. When the team said one looked perfect, quiet hands carried that embryo to the operating room, where Dr. Alvarez waited to place it inside the new womb. They transferred the embryo, and then, for a few weeks, the world became waiting. Small blood tests, tiny signs to watch for, whispered prayers at night.
Yeah.
At first, the tests were hopeful. The pregnancy line showed up. The clinic scheduled scans and checkups. But life, as it always does, crowded in. Arlo was offered a promotion that required long hours and a trip to another city to train a new team. Quentin,
Oh, really?
trying hard to be cautious and patient, still needed to finish grading and lesson plans. Medical bills arrived like clouds. and they both picked up extra hours to keep the apartment and the roof over their heads. They missed some appointments, not because they did not care, but because one emergency bled into another. A broken heater in winter, an unexpected one-week assignment Arlo could not refuse, the rent that needed paying now. The clinic left voicemail reminders that went unanswered.
Oh,
When
really?
they did call back, it felt like apologizing for being alive and complicated. Those were the weeks the story grew a secret. The embryo, placed with care, had quietly done what embryos sometimes do. It split. Early on, in a moment no one could have seen, one cell became two, and two became separate people growing from the same original egg and sperm. No test they could see would tell them that for sure without the scheduled scans, and their scans had been missed. For most of the pregnancy, Quentin felt odd things that he told himself were normal:
Well, no, or normal.
tiredness,
Yeah,
strange aches, hunger at odd hours. He learned the slow, intimate language of a body changing. At
yeah.
7 months, when they had both thought they had time, when they had promised each other that they would go to the 9-month mark together, Quentin woke in the night with a pain that made him sit up like someone who had been shocked. It
Well, really?
was not the soft, expected pain of stretching, it was sharp and rolling. He tried to breathe through it. Then it came again, a more violent set of cramps. Arlo found him at the kitchen table, face pale, hands on the spot where the babies were. They called an ambulance. The hospital felt familiar now in a different way. Doctors moved quickly. An ultrasound machine, the one they had not used for weeks, slid its cool head across Quentin's stomach and showed the screen that made everyone in the room quiet and then gasp. "There's two," Dr. Alvarez said, but he did not wear the iron calm of the man who had done the transplant. He sounded small. 2 heartbeats, close and steady on the monitor. 2 babies stacked in the new womb, pressing and moving and alive. No one had expected it. The clinic's records
Oh,
showed one embryo had been transferred. The lab had not intended twins. But sometimes, in the
twins.
smallest chemistry of life, one becomes two. They
Yeah.
prepared for an emergency delivery. At 28 weeks, the babies were early. The team moved fast. Lights, hands, machines. Arlo squeezed Quentin's hand until his fingers ached. "You're going to hold them," Arlo whispered, though both of them sounded like they were talking to a future that had only just been born. The first C-section was a flurry of motion and sound. The world narrowed to the single cry that mattered. A nurse wrapped a tiny body and held it up. "A boy," someone said. Then the pause, a silence that pulled at the edges of the room, and then the second cry. A second round of hands reached in. The second baby arrived, smaller, quicker, and also crying. For a breath, Quentin could not breathe. He had thought he was going to meet one child. He had tried to imagine that small face, to plan a name, to know the smell of his own child. Instead of one, there were 2 small faces wrapped in hospital blankets, 2 sets of fingers curling, 2 tiny lungs working. Arlo laughed and sobbed at the same time. A nurse walked out of the operating room with an exhausted, triumphant smile and a clipboard. "Twins," she told the waiting room as
Twins.
if that should be obvious now. "Identical
I think
twins."
or twins.
The words landed with a weight that stunned them. Identical.
Oh, could be.
From one egg fertilized by one sperm. Somehow, at a moment earlier than
Oh,
anyone had seen, that one embryo had split and grown as 2 perfectly mirrored lives. Later, in a quiet room with a whiteboard and soft chairs, Dr. Alvarez explained simply. "You used Quentin's egg and Arlo's sperm," he said. "They joined in the lab and made one embryo. We put it into Quentin. In the very early days after fertilization, sometimes the single embryo splits into 2 separate embryos. When they come from
yeah.
the same egg and the same sperm, the children are genetically identical, twins who look like mirrors of each other." He told them the science gently, like someone reading a difficult book aloud. He said
Yeah.
that because they missed the early scans, no one saw the split. By the time the pain started, both babies had been there for months, growing and beating and waiting. Both babies were born by C-section and taken to neonatal care. They were tiny and brave. The first week was a blur of tubes and monitors and the odd, fierce joy of seeing 2 sets of small fingers wrap around an adult thumb. Friends flooded the hospital with bowls of soup and sleepy smiles. Strangers asked questions in ways that felt clumsy, but
Yeah.
Quentin and Arlo only had space for each other and the 2 small lives that had come to them in the most unexpected way. When a nurse finally handed them a brief paper showing the genetic workup, there it was. One egg, one sperm, two identical heartbeats.
Yeah.
Arlo wept as he read the line that said monozygotic twins, mostly because the word was a small proof that their dream had become a doubled miracle. There were
Yeah.
hard things
Literally.
ahead,
Literally.
preemie
Yeah.
lungs to help, time in the NICU, conversations about parenting and schedules, and sleeplessness multiplied by two. There would be
Yeah.
questions from family members and strangers. There would be insurance calls. There would be a lifetime of explaining, in different ways, how this had happened. But under it all, there was a steady, ridiculous joy.
TPP.
Quentin held the smaller baby against his chest and felt a rhythm that matched his own. Arlo stood beside him and pressed his forehead to Quentin's shoulder. They are ours, Arlo said simply. Both of them. This was not a fairy tale where everything was easy. It was a story of risk and patience, of choices that felt dangerous and necessary. It was also a quiet reminder that life finds its way in strange and tender
Yeah.
ways.
True
The
that.
science that helped them, the egg retrieval, the lab fertilization, the uterus transplant, was a human answer to a simple wish. What neither science nor planning could control was the small, private miracle of one becoming two. If there is a single line to carry out of this telling, it is this. Families are made in many ways, sometimes in the places we expect, sometimes in surprises. Quentin and Arlo had set out for one child and returned with two, and for all their missed appointments, their reckless hope had shaped a new life, double and
Literally. Yeah.
beautiful, in a body that the world had not expected to carry them. Would you have gone through the same risks to have a child with your partner? What would you have done in their place?
Yeah. I will do that something. Yeah. Yeah. I will do that something. Yeah. That was this month's like everyone of a giving birth to identical twins, but that got tossed. The link to the video will be the description below. Go and check them out and drop a like if you like and comment below if you want to see more reaction like this one. And subscribe if you're new and click the bell so you can be notified when I upload in my bot. Wow.